I'll introduce Chin. So Chin's been really active in the Vancouver startup scene and have been helping a lot of early stage startups, over hundreds, right, Chin?
Yeah.
Yeah, over 100 early stage startups. So he's been experienced in a lot of those early stage startup mistakes and pitfalls and things like that. So he's one of the better guidance in terms of early stage startups. So we'll do a lot of questions and answers today. So if you go to Slido later on and log on to our channel SGX, let me just turn it back on. So SGR Richmond BC, and then you'll be able to ask your questions, and we'll do the question and answer session later on. Okay, so we'll start we'll do it in a more interactive way this time for the workshop. So I'll ask the questions, and then Chin can answer those kind of questions. So one of those, what we'll do is that a lot of those common mistakes that early stage founders or maybe first time entrepreneurs made. What are those common mistakes that you've seen so far, Chin?
Sure. Maybe before I jump into that, I'll do a quick intro of myself as well.
Yeah,
so, yeah, thanks for having me, Kenneth, and great to see you all, everyone. A bit about my background and kind of a small disclaimer before I begin. So I spent the last 5 years here in Vancouver working for an incubator accelerator known as Spring. Spring focuses on working with social ventures. So we help companies pretty much from the idea stage through to the stage where they're launched and ready and starting to make some revenue and looking to raise money from investors. In the mix of doing some of that work, in the last 5 years, I've probably worked with over 500 entrepreneurs now. And we kind of specialize in, because we work with social ventures, we don't only work with tech companies. So I've seen very interesting ideas that are non-tech. I've seen very interesting ways to test different concepts from, even a retail store to launching food and beverage products in many different ways where they're not, using as much capital as you might think they would. So hopefully I'll be able to share some of that insight today. The quick disclaimer here is I am an entrepreneur myself as well, and I'm also working on my third business right now. So I don't claim to know everything. And I think I'm not like Gary Vaynerchuk or anyone like that. I'm not an expert, but I'll try my best to share at least what I've seen in terms of entrepreneurs that are on the right path, that seem to find a bit more success than others, mistakes that I see some entrepreneurs making, and kind of what happens when their business end up shutting down, or what leads towards them having to shut down their business. So hopefully some of the insights today will be quite informative. As Kenneth mentioned, there is the Slido that you can post your questions to. I think some of us might be having issues looking at Slido when he does the share screen, but he can see all the questions and he can read that out as well.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, I mean, your first question was, what are some of the biggest mistakes that I see a lot of entrepreneurs making? Quite a few. So I'll try my best to cover as much as I can. The first one that I typically see happens more with tech entrepreneurs, but I see it also happening a lot with entrepreneurs that have a lot of experience in a specific industry. So for example, let's say if someone is a real estate agent and they want to build a real estate related solution. Then the more experience a person has in that solution, in that space, I tend to find that they tend to think they know what their customers want, and they have that mindset of build it and they will come. Like if they build a great product, the customers will definitely want to use it because they really feel like they know exactly what the customers want or what customers need. So the key over there is just to be very careful of that and always continue to listen to your customers, because sometimes there are a lot of assumptions that need to actually be verified because they might or might not be true. Another big one that I see is opportunists. So people who go into entrepreneurship for the wrong reasons. So that happens a lot, especially with the early stage, when they're at the idea stage. So I think I see this the most when people go into entrepreneurship because they think they want to start a business and make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Or they want to do it because they want to have all the flexibility in the world. And what I find with opportunists is that there's nothing wrong with wanting to make money, but the key thing to be careful about is money shouldn't be your sole driver. Because I find that the entrepreneurs that start businesses for opportunities, they tend to give up the quickest when it comes to facing challenges or dealing with things that are unforeseen. So I find that the ones who instead focus more on a personal mission, a cause that they're really passionate about, those are the ones who have a very strong North Star. And regardless of the challenges that come across, they tend to find detours around it, and they still tend to persist the most. And you've probably heard of this concept called grit by Angela Duckworth. So it's really about persevering. Because normally what I find is the entrepreneurs that tend to be the most successful are not usually the most creative or the most innovative. What you normally see is it's just the people who are most consistent with what they're doing. So as long as they stick to it, they tend to find a lot more success.
Yeah.
So those are some highlights. On a later stage, once they start to grow, once they launch, another big problem I see with some companies is that they tend to scale too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean by scaling too quickly is they end up raising capital or they grow their team. And great advice that one of my good friends and mentor told me. So John Chan from 2XCD, which is a design agency that focuses on conversion rate optimization, he was talking about how startups should focus on being more like a cockroach rather than a unicorn. Because it's better to survive rather than become a huge unicorn that implodes on itself. So a lot of startups you see, they try to raise capital, they grow the team, but with capital and with team comes a lot of expenses as well. So you're probably seeing this now in the current COVID situation, because sales suddenly drop and they don't have the revenue to sustain all of the expenses that they're incurring, and they are forced to basically shut down their business. So in that sense, sometimes you want to be mindful of how you scale as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of startups, they tend to scale before they got actually any traction or product market fit, or maybe because they got some money. they can spend and they can't scale after they got the money to do so. Yeah. So how do you come up with like a good startup idea? Like if I want to be an entrepreneur, how do I come up with a startup idea?
If anyone is in that stage where they're thinking of an idea, I would just be cautious about how you approach it. So like I mentioned before, don't go at it for the opportunity, go at it because you're really passionate about it. So the first thing to usually start is, I find that entrepreneurs usually ground themselves in one of two things. So either they are passionate about solving a specific problem, and they don't really care who the customer is. So like, for example, in my case, with my current business, I'm passionate about education. I'm passionate about helping people discover their own purpose, discover their values, rather than focusing on who exactly I'm serving. So I'm quite open to, whether it's for entrepreneurs or whether it's for students or whether it's for professionals. On the other hand, sometimes I see some entrepreneurs that are really focused on the customers and they don't really care so much about the cause. So for example, you might say, I really care about helping seniors. And in that case, you might find that, seniors actually don't have the problem that you think they have, but then you're willing to pivot and kind of adjust your business based on what problems they do have.
Yeah, that's good advice. How do I know if my idea is good? Like, how do I validate the idea and the demand for it? Like, if I think I have an idea.
Validating demand and testing your idea. So typically, I would say when it comes to testing your idea, the first thing to do is to identify the assumptions that you have. So a good place to start is a tool like a business model canvas, something simple to at least help you map out the business. I was actually just recently speaking to a student this morning who wanted to create a platform for students to help them, find the best courses and all of that. And she wants to do it as a social venture, but she didn't quite think about like who's the customer, who's going to pay for it, how is she going to structure the solution. So using a simple tool like a business model canvas will help you just map out the basics. It also prevents you from overanalyzing things. I find that if you use a tool like a business plan, having to write like a 60-page or 100-page long document, you tend to get into analysis paralysis and you don't take action because you find that you're too worried about what could happen or what wouldn't happen, right? So map it out, and then from mapping it out, then you can start to identify the assumptions. And then the next step is once you know what your assumptions are, you want to go out and try to validate or invalidate those assumptions. So the methodology that a lot of startup or entrepreneurs use is known as customer discovery. So you're going out, you're trying to speak to your customers, you're trying to see if they actually have those assumptions that you think they have. And then the second level is you need to actually test demand then. So customer discovery helps you decide what to build if you're still kind of figuring that out. But once you know what you want to build, then you need to test if people will actually buy it, pay for it. And then from there, how you do that is through what we call minimum viable products. So how can you create a simplified version of your solution to gauge and see if people are willing to use it? So a great example, one of the companies we work with, MuseFind. They were Jennifer, who started the company. She was trying to create a platform that would connect influencers with brands. So the idea is, if you're Nike, if you're looking for, let's say, the hottest influencer in Singapore who has a following of a lot of young girls who like handbags, for example. So what she would do with MuseFind is she created a landing page, and in this case, it's a tech one. So a simple landing page that said, "Hey, we are MuseFind. We connect brands with influencers. If you are a brand looking for your best influencer in your market, give us a shout, and we will use our special algorithm to help you find and match with an influencer." So all of that was, of course, it's just a simple landing page, and nothing was actually built. And she actually sold $25,000 in sales off that landing page. And companies would call her, and she would say, "Yes, tell me what you need." And she would say, "Based on what you're saying, give us a week. We'll put it all into our system, and then the algorithms will help you find the best influencer." But really, the algorithm was just her brain, and she would go on Google and she would do the searching, and then she would call them a week later and say, "Hey, based on your criteria, our algorithm suggests this 3 top influencers in your market." So that was kind of how she started, and then eventually she brought on a tech person to help her build everything out. So that's more of a tech example. For more of a non-tech example, I think Brienne is a great example. So Brienne Miller started Nada Grocery, which is a grocery store. And usually if you want to open up a grocery store, the initial idea is like, okay, I need to lease a location, I need to do renos, I need to buy a whole bunch of product, and then I open my doors and hope for the best, right? So in her case, she actually did it very innovatively. So we suggested a few things to her. So one of the assumptions was, it's been done before in places like Texas, in Belgium, but she doesn't know if Vancouverites are actually ready to change behavior and come to a grocery store without any packaging and bring their own containers. So she actually started, first off, we said, "Hey, why don't you test to see if there is a community in Vancouver who cares enough about the environment?" So she created the Zero Waste Vancouver Facebook group. So it would be a group on Facebook where people would just share best practices around how to live a lifestyle with minimal waste. And that's kind of how she built her initial customer base to also market towards. And then when she was ready to actually start to gauge if customers were willing to pay for it, she actually did pop-up shops. So she partnered up with Patagonia, and she just asked the manager, and she said, "Hey, I'm thinking of doing this. Would it be okay if I just tried to sell some of my products in your store?" Because she had identified that people who go to Patagonia are people who are outdoor enthusiasts who care about the environment. And she just had a small table, like about 2 meters long. She had a bunch of jars with different products, and she was just trying to, see if people would buy it. And lo and behold, she actually did a pretty amazing job. It got to the stage where I think she did about 39 pop-ups before actually leasing the retail location. And that was over a period of about 2 years. At the end, before she opened up her retail, she actually was making an average of about $3,500 per weekend. And it was kind of maximized because she didn't have enough space.
Right.
So that kind of gave her the confidence that people were ready to actually buy. And it also made it a lot easier for her to get a loan to actually lease the location, because she could prove to the bank that, hey, it's not just a crazy idea, I have customers, right?
Yeah, I think that is like one of a good way for business, especially if you are not long-tech. It's harder to get initial financing from traditional bank or traditional finance institution, right? They usually want to see you have a cash flow. That kind of builds up the cash flow before she actually need more money to actually establish a more long-term business. I guess that's a really good example that we can do. Yeah. So how about what if, for especially for, I guess, for first-time entrepreneurs, they sometimes they are scared that people will steal their idea. What do you think? What they should think or what they should do in that sense when talking to people about their business ideas.
Cool. Sorry, I'm slightly distracted because the question I'm reading on Slido is the question I mentioned, but I'll try to address both of that. So first I'll address your question, the one about stealing your ideas. I think first off, consider the context. Who are you sharing your idea with? If I've heard a lot of investors complain to me about, why is this entrepreneur asking me to sign an NDA? So for those of you who are not aware, an NDA is a non-disclosure agreement. And normally, if you're sharing with an investor or an advisor, there's no point in asking them to sign an NDA, because they probably hear, thousands or hundreds of ideas every month, right? So I would say your idea is probably not as unique as you think it is. And if they're not in a position where they will be interested in stealing your idea, don't waste your time. So first off, who are you sharing with? If you are sharing with someone who has the potential to steal your idea, i.e. a competitor or maybe, let's say, a developer, then what you might want to do then is you want to also consider the context of how much you're sharing. So if you're just sharing what you're doing and it's easy enough for someone to actually steal your idea just based on what you're doing, maybe your idea might not be the best idea. Your barrier of entry is too low and probably not as innovative as you think it is. What I find is generally there's probably at least about 15 other people who are working on the exact same idea that you were doing. And even if you go online, if you can't find someone who's working on the idea, it might be because they're same as you, still in the startup stage, not launched yet. Or it might actually be because your idea is actually not a good idea. So some ideas, for example, aren't quite meant to see the light of day, I would say. Just because it doesn't exist doesn't mean it should exist, because sometimes there might not be a market for it. People might not be willing to pay for it as well. I don't know if that answers the question fully, but maybe I'll jump to the question that I'm looking at on Slido. How can you determine if your idea has been truly validated? How many data points? So I would say at the early stage, there is no easy metric for validation. The most important thing to determine at the early stage is what I call directional significance, not so much statistical significance. Because you as the founder, you as the entrepreneur, it is really all up to you to decide if you want to continue with your project or if you want to give up. So like they say, businesses don't fail, founders get a job, right? So what you want to be mindful about is if you're trying to validate your idea, you're usually validating small assumptions and you're iterating your business to adjust to what you're learning. So most businesses will never be perfect on day one. So you're usually evolving based on what you're learning. So the starting point is just to really understand like what are the patterns. So you don't have to worry as much about statistical significance. So like I mentioned, if you're evaluating, one easy starting point is once you know your assumptions, you go out and start to do customer discovery. And one way of looking at the numbers then is when you do customer discovery, a kind of number that is good is probably around, if you're B2C, customer facing, about 75. The reason why 75 is a good number is because the first about 10 to 15 interviews that you do with your customers will probably just help you realize if you're asking the right questions. And then the rest kind of help you get a sense of, what are the patterns, what are the problems that they're facing, how do they describe it? Are they actually, is it problem number 1 on their list or problem number 20 on their list? So the idea is just to kind of get a good sense of like, am I building the right thing? And then once you know if you're actually building the right thing, then you actually have to test demand through, like I mentioned, those different minimum viable products. And then that's where you kind of optimize, because there's no easy answer, right? Sometimes someone might not be responding to you. It might not be because your idea is a bad idea. It might be because you're using the wrong language to describe it. Or maybe you're pricing incorrectly, or maybe you're going after the wrong type customer. So there are too many factors to really put into play. But then you probably heard this term in business where they talk about product market fit. So product market fit is a bit easier to define. So that's more when you have customers and they're using. And the bigger question is your solution actually something that can be more generalizable to the larger marketplace? And in that sense, I think two examples of how people try to describe product market fit. So I think Eric Ries mentioned, or someone else, but one example is if you're in a position where demand is higher than your supply. That means, for example, if you're, let's say, if you're a tech company, there are more users signing up than your servers can handle. Or if you're a product company, more people are buying or pre-ordering your products than you can actually produce, right? That gives you a good idea that, hey, you're actually on the right track. And then on the other hand, another example that I think Ben Horowitz said is, if 40% of your customers will actually say that, I would really hate it if we lost your product or if we couldn't get access to your service. So if you have a good net promoter score, or if a lot of customers are really satisfied with your product, then you're probably onto something as well.
Yeah, that's good. So should we go with the Slido questions later when we do the Q&A, or should we go with the questions first?
Up to you. Because if you're not doing the Slido questions, then maybe it's just going to be easier to turn off the Slido screen so I don't get distracted by it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess we can actually keep going and fill in with my questions later on as well. So. And I think this next question is actually quite similar, or kind of tied to the original question as well. So once an idea is validated, and if your idea is a red ocean idea, how do you go about making yourself different? What's your UVP? UVPS for unique value proposition.
Yep. So I think the person who's asking this idea is probably already familiar with the book Blue Ocean Strategy, which is kind of where the term red ocean and blue ocean comes from. So red ocean is kind of, you're in that murky place where you're competing with a lot of other sharks, a lot of competitors, and everyone's killing each other to get the customer. So you get that bloodbath of red ocean. Blue ocean is kind of where you can create that white space or go into a new market where no one else is serving. So actually, I think the book actually has a great example, but I'll quickly summarize it, and I'll talk about some other ideas as well. So in the book, one of my favorite examples is how, first thing that you want to do is you want to look at how existing competitors are competing in your marketplace. So you're looking at what are the factors that they commonly talk about. So for example, if you listen to any car dealership ad, you notice that they all sound exactly the same. 0 down, 0% interest. So they always talk about the same sort of features. So the idea is you first do an analysis on your marketplace, on your competitive space, to see how everyone is talking about their solutions. And then what you want to try to do is you want to look at mapping that out on a chart and see what you can, 4 things. So one, what can you eliminate? What can you create? What can you increase? And what can you decrease? So the example that they give in their book, I'll just go through one of the simple examples. So Yellowtail Wine, which is a wine production company, and they're based out of Australia. So when they started, very, very simple. Obviously, the wine marketplace is very competitive. There are 2 levels of wines. There's high-end wines, and then you have budget wines. So they all tend to compete on the same factors. High-end wines will compete on the prestige of the chateau. They will talk about complex flavors. They'll talk about they'll use a lot of jargon, and then budget wines, they compete on pricing, they compete on simplicity, things like that. So they tend to have very similar things that all of the wines will compete on. And then what Yellowtail did is they said, hey, looking out there in the market, who else drinks alcoholic beverages but doesn't quite like the existing wine brands? And they identified that, oh, you know what? Beer drinkers, people who drink coolers, they find that the wine community is very snobbish, and they don't want to come across as being snobbish as well. So they say, hey, why don't we try to create a wine that is for that community? And based on identifying that, they said, okay, what can we increase, decrease, create and eliminate? So they said, okay, we'll focus less on the chateau, the prestige, the complexity of flavor. We'll focus more on simple taste that basically anyone can enjoy without having to really know a lot about wine. They use really simple packaging. So just kind of identifying, I don't remember exactly the full story there, but that helped them really map out and show how they're different. Other things that I see help in terms of competitive differentiation, 3 things come to mind. So one is creating a community. So it's, depending on your solution, it is almost impossible to prevent competitors to copy you. But what happens is people can copy your product or solution, but it's much harder to steal your customers away if they're in a community. So if you build a strong community, then people will be attached to that community. Second thing is building a brand. So instead of focusing on the product or solution, if you focus on the brand, you usually have a much stronger chance of surviving any competitors, similar to Apple, right? There are a lot of other smartphone providers out there, but people still prefer Apple because Apple has a strong reputation, strong brand for quality. And then the third one is integration. So if you can think about how you can integrate your existing solutions with both the customer's lives and other solutions that a customer uses, then the harder it is for them to actually move away from your solution. So for example, if let's say you have a payroll solution where you help people with managing payroll and paying their employees, and then if you integrate it with, let's say, their tax systems, if you integrate it with their invoicing and all of that, then it becomes harder for them to actually switch to a different provider because they have to migrate more things over. So the more you can integrate, the harder it is for someone to switch.
Yeah, and so what if we don't have enough money but we have the business idea, but we don't have money to start up? Like, how should entrepreneurs and founders, go about this?
Sorry, I'm thinking of so many things within this question. So first off, most business ideas will probably need a lot less than you think to validate. So to kind of go back to one example that I mentioned, so Brianna and the grocery store, when she started her pop-up shops, like they cost her maybe about $100 to set up the initial store and buy the initial ingredients. And from there, she could make a lot more revenue coming out of that. And now she's actually making about $2 million a year in annual revenue. So that all in about 4 years time. Mm-hmm. So even though you think running a business or starting something might require a lot of upfront capital, there are probably ways to kind of get around that, especially in this day and age where so much is enabled by tech, and everything has almost been done by someone that is coming before us. And then the next question that usually comes out of that is, should I consider raising from investors? Should I bootstrap? Should I borrow money from a bank? So the things that I've learned so far, debt capital, so borrowing from a bank, borrowing from, let's say, Futurepreneur, things like that, is great in certain situations. So debt is only good if you're in a growth stage. So you want to try to avoid debt if you're not growing because it's very risky. The last thing you want to do is if your business fails, that you actually end up in a situation where you still owe money as well and have to pay with your personal accounts. So that is great when you're growing. And then if it's more for operational capital, then again, that when you're growing, but for operational. Investors, usually you have to be very mindful of that. I think a lot of entrepreneurs tend to get so excited by the idea of running a unicorn, raising money from investors. But the most dangerous thing is taking capital from investors comes with a lot of expectations. Mm-hmm. They don't just give you free money. It's not charity, right? They're investing, they're expecting return. So once you start to collect money from investors, they will push you for results. You've basically effectively found yourself a boss. So good and bad, right? If you're the kind of person who needs that external motivation, then great. But if you don't want to be pushed to grow like a hyperscale company, maybe it's not quite for you. Some entrepreneurs want to build more of a lifestyle company where it's profitable, but it doesn't have to be like super growth. So in that case, you want to just be mindful about, do you want to raise some investors? Because if you do, they typically will want to push you to go down the VC route, venture scale, and actually collect money from venture capital and start to grow globally. And there's a really, really high return rate that they're looking for. It's usually about 30x their return. Mm-hmm. So might not be for everyone. So just have to be mindful of that.
Yeah, and I guess for tech companies nowadays, it can be harder to waste money in this situation of COVID-19, where a lot of the money may be drying up quite quickly. So maybe the revenue is the best source of early money. So if you get a product or service that you can actually build a business around, you can get revenue to actually keep it going.
Yeah.
And if you can't get the revenue, I guess the business is not ready yet. You have to figure out how to get it going. Yeah. So if we find out the business idea doesn't seem to work, or the market that I'm trying to get into is maybe not the best market, how should we, or when should we pivot?
Sorry, I was just thinking of something before, so I'll address that before I come back to your question. So just kind of my brain lagging behind. I was thinking about the money and the competitor question. What you're seeing in the current market as well is competitors are more preoccupied with surviving right now. So usually you don't have to worry about them, shelling out a whole bunch of money to squash you. But the bad news is there are a lot more startups to compete with now, because actually during recessions, during this type of situations, you find that there are a lot more new startups because people are laid off, people are unemployed. They're finally deciding, okay, maybe I'll try what I've always been planning on doing. So that's where you have a lot of people who are similar to you that you're competing with. So cash is less of a problem in those situations, but you just have to be innovative about capturing the market. Sorry, back to your question.
Yeah.
What was your question again?
Well, when or how
pivot.
should I pivot?
Yeah, I would say there are indicators of if you should pivot. So the few indicators that I've started to recognize is, number one is if you're not growing. Because if you're a startup, you should be growing. Technically, you haven't really hit that top of the curve. So you should always be growing. If you're finding that you're struggling with growing, then maybe you might need to change something. Number two is if your unit economics don't work. So no matter what, if you have a great amount of customers, you have a lot of people coming in, but you just can't seem to make cash flow meet, then there might be something that you need to adjust as well. I forgot what the third one was. But yeah, the pivot place. Let me quickly take a look at my notes just so I can remind myself. Pivot. And retention, yeah. So if you find that people are jumping on your platform, but you're struggling to retain them, there might be something wrong with what you have as well. So probably the biggest thing about pivots is pivots are not as drastic as a lot of people think. Some people think that, if I'm pivoting my business, it means I might be doing a 180 and doing something completely different. Usually I find that the best pivots are pivots that are grounded. So they're usually grounded in three things. So one is they're grounded in their mission. So whatever they do, they're still going towards the same North Star. They're not going from AR, VR to doing drones to doing self-driving cars, right? Like that's a completely different business. You're not doing a pivot in that case. Pivots can be even small things like changing your pricing, changing your marketing channels. So in that sense, same North Star. Number two is grounded in things that you learn. So you don't just throw shit on the wall and see what sticks. You're actually, doing tests and actually seeing like, okay, I've learned this, therefore I'm going to change this. And then the third thing is usually where I kind of mentioned, where they're usually grounded in either the customer or the problem. So you might find out that, customer actually doesn't have problem X, maybe I'll go after problem Y. Or you might say that, you know what, I'm focused on the problem, not focused on the customers. And I find that maybe students aren't the ideal customer, but professionals are willing to pay for it. Therefore, I'm going to target professionals instead. So I'm oversimplifying, but I think those things are fairly true for most businesses.
Yeah, I think the journey to find product market fit is to just try to see if there's a market for different target audience. Sometimes it works, and a lot of the successful companies actually pivot. Like Slack, actually originally it's like part of a game. It's part of an online game, and then they pivot into this application tool that they've been using internally. Now it's like one of the bigger tech companies in the world. So yeah, and well, for next questions now, if we want to find a mentor or advisor to help us, to build a business when we are early, how do we find them?
Good question. Not enough entrepreneurs do this, I find. The biggest thing I see is like, if someone else has walked the path before you, why go through all the same mistakes? Find someone else who's already doing it and learn from them. And don't be afraid to ask for help. So how I've actually approached it, and I had a good friend of mine, Steven, when we started on this path for entrepreneurship, before I even joined Spring, I said, hey, I want to find a mentor. And Steven did the same thing as well. So we actually outlined a process. So the first step of the process is you want to identify what your objective is. So what do you want to accomplish or what do you want to learn? So for example, you might say, I want to grow my business to a stage where I'm making about $20,000 in revenue a month. Or you might say, I want to raise capital. Or you might say, I want to learn how to do marketing. So once you identify what your objective or what you want to learn is, then the next step is to think who is best for it. So in that case, you might say, okay, if I want to learn how to raise capital, maybe Keith Ippel, who is here in Vancouver, he's a startup expert who's really experienced in raising capital. I'm going to make him my mentor, right? So now you know who is the best for it. Then the third step is to start to get on their radar. And when I say get on their radar, actually, there's a few different colors to that. So number one is not every mentor knows how to mentor. So you first need to define like how you want to get value from this mentor. So in some cases, it might be, you might have a formal mentor relationship. In other cases, it might be as simple as just sending them a, let's say weekly or monthly update and asking for their feedback on specific questions. Or it could even be as light as, reading a book that they have, something like that as well. So you want to know how you want to learn from them. And then on the getting on their radar piece, if your mentor is someone who's really, really reputable, so let's say, for example, you say, I want to make Elon Musk my mentor. Not impossible. So a lot of people struggle with it is because if they see that their mentor is someone who is too reputable, they feel like, oh, how am I going to get Elon Musk to be my mentor? And I swear by this. I feel that if you really want to make Elon Musk your mentor, you can follow my process and you probably get there. So the first step is approach the people around them. So it's much easier to approach people around Elon, like maybe his wife, his friends, his mentees, if he has any, his employees, instead of going after him directly. Or you can also start to try to show up where he's showing up. So, you can see Elon's actually quite active on Twitter, right? So if you start to be active on Twitter and you start to respond to his posts or reshare his tweets, he will start to notice you. Or let's say if he goes to certain events and trade shows, like the idea is you want to start to get noticed in places that they are. And then once that is the case, then you start to get to know the people in the network. And then the next step is you want to start to build a relationship with them. And then you can decide if you need to formalize a relationship by saying, hey, will you be my mentor? Or if, you can learn in other ways where you don't have to formalize it as well. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Usually how does the mentor and advisor compensate in terms of the, the work that they do with the startups or the businesses? What are the common practice or common, way to handle this situation?
At least the way I see it, a mentor is usually more personal, an advisor is usually more tactical. So usually mentors are not compensated. They usually care a lot about you and they want to help you as a person and they'll give you advice. Advisors are usually very specific. So you might say, oh, I need a sales advisor. I need a tech advisor. So they're typically compensated. Compensation will depend on what their expectations are. So for example, if you're a tech company, you typically compensate advisors by giving them equity. And the norm is usually anywhere from 0.1% to 2.5%, so not that much. If you're running, let's say, a consulting company or a service company or product company, advisors typically are by the hour, so you actually pay them an hourly consultation fee. So that's kind of the biggest difference I see between a mentor and an advisor.
That's good. What other advice do you have for people that are just starting or they have an idea they want to start?
What I found the most useful for myself is leveraging my network. And how I do that is I send a monthly advisor update email. And I actually send this not only advisors that I formally recognize, but also to early customers as well. So I send it once a month. I kind of cover, what are my updates, what I've done, what I'm learning. So updates is one thing. I talk about challenges I'm facing as well. So things I need help with. I usually talk about what I'm thankful for as well. So I have a gratuity section. So if people made intros for me, if people gave me specific advice that I executed on, so I normally cover that in the update email as well. And then I usually wrap it up with a single ask. So the ask is usually like, let's say I might say, oh, I'm looking for media relations to help promote my event. Or I might say, oh, I'm looking for feedback on this specific thing. So that's kind of what I've been doing. And I found that it's helped a lot because it's actually given me a lot of room to actually work with some new ideas. I've had people volunteer through that. I've had people make connections to media for me for that. So it's been quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it is a good practice, and I think this is one of the way how we kind of hook up and kind of work together in different projects. Because I'm reading your newsletter, and I figure out what your you're working on and what you need help with, and then that's how it goes, how it all starts. Okay, so we finished my Q&A part, and we can start the Q&A with the audience questions on Slido. So if you have questions, feel free to go to our Slido and ask your questions there. So we'll start with the first one. So what type of team do you need to put together to validate your idea? Cost function and what?
So what I find with teams, usually the best teams at a starting line is diverse teams. Mm-hmm. So the more difference in experience and skills, the better. And diversity not only with skills, but also diversity with background and mindset as well. So having good gender balance, having good racial balance as well. But all of that really stems from cognitive diversity. So the idea is you're not trying to look for people who are exactly the same as you. Mm-hmm. But the challenge then lies, like, how do you find alignment then? So usually the most important part I find is alignment on mission and alignment on values. If they care about what you're trying to do, and if they share the same values on how it's done or executed, then that usually is a good starting point for a team to form. The typical balance for a startup team is usually about 3 co-founders. Mm-hmm. And when I say co-founders, usually most co-founder relationships are started because these 3 people come up with the idea together. Mm-hmm. Usually in most cases where someone is like, hey, I have this idea, I'm going out to recruit a co-founding team. Mm-hmm. In that case, it's not quite a co-founding team. It's usually early team members rather than co-founders. And the best balance is usually you have someone who is business related, you have someone who is design oriented, and you have someone who is product oriented. So product oriented could be, if you're a restaurant, it could be a chef, or if you're tech, then you would be a developer.
Yeah, that's good. Next question. So do you have any recommendations on helping startup owners maintain a positive mindset as they execute on validation, as it can be an quite emotional journey, and sometimes it can be quite lonely journey as well if they are a solo founder?
Yeah, no easy answer here. It's been a roller coaster for me as well, and I'm sure it's the same for you, Kenneth, as well, since you're running your own business. I'd say that the first thing that I find helps is surrounding yourself with your peers, with other entrepreneurs as well, because they share the same mindset as you. They kind of understand what you're going through. The second is, leaning on your mentors. Actually going after people who have more experience and actually having them validate, not if your idea is good or bad, but if your approach is good or bad. So yeah, and then of course, if you have a team that helps as well, but not everyone has to have a team at the start.
Yeah, I think this is why startup grind or any startup community is good in the sense that you can group a lot of like-minded people. Entrepreneurs is like a lonely journey, so if you have peer group and peer support, it will be easier that way. So next question. So Michael asked, what personality qualities in founders do you find correlate to success and or failure? And what in know thyself is important to know and resolve?
Personality qualities, I think I mentioned grit. So the tenacity to kind of focus on the idea and not give up on it. But at the same time, like, the grit is also kind of, in certain cases, confused with stubbornness as well. So the idea is you don't want to be too stubborn, but you still want to have that true North Star. So normally the biggest difference I see between grit and stubbornness is, if you're stubborn, you're doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. But if you are tenacious, you're trying different ways, but you still have the same end goal. So that's kind of the biggest difference there. Knowing thyself, I think the first step is really knowing like what your personal mission is, because typically most business missions will stem from a founder's personal mission. And then the second thing is, sorry, I don't know if I froze up or if you froze up. It looked like Kenneth might have frozen. I think someone, I still hear someone. Sorry. Knowing about, so I mentioned mission, and then the next one is probably values. Because I find usually a lot of decision making, especially when you're considering business decisions, it's really hard to paint a black and white or define like what is a good decision versus what's a bad decision. So normally what I find is the best decisions are made when they align with your values or your organization's values. So it's not just pros and cons, because my pros and cons might be different from your pros and cons. So if you know your own values, then it helps you shape your company values. And from there, you can recruit other people who share similar values. Then you are more comfortable with letting them make decisions as opposed to having to micromanage everything. So I hope that answers the question, Michael.
Okay, so next questions. So what startup mistakes do you see on the equity raise side? So when they try to raise funding, guys.
So on that front, probably like I mentioned, scaling too quickly or trying to raise money too quickly. So what I use as my benchmark is there's this great acronym that Dave McCurry from 500 Startups uses. So AARRR, it's known as Pirate Metrics. So R like a pirate. But the first A is acquisition. Second A is activation. And then retention, revenue, and then referral. So normally if you're thinking about raising for equity, you want to make sure that you have the first three things. So you've figured out acquisition channels, your cost of acquisition, and then you actually have activation. So maybe you're great at marketing, but are people actually using your product or service? And then do you actually have retention? Do people actually stick around long enough, right? And the reason why these three things are important is because if you raise money, most investors will want to have the confidence that you're not experimenting with their money, that you're actually being able to tell them, hey, you know what, if you give me, $100,000, if I put $10,000 into Facebook ads, I know how many more new customers I'll get. And these customers will activate. What's the percentage? How long will they stay around for? So that gives them the confidence that at least you can figure out the monetization piece down the road because you've already at least nailed down some of the basics. So at figuring out AARR. And then the second thing is making sure you get advice from consultants who are on your side. So that's the easiest way to put it. Because I find that if you ask for fundraising advice from investors, they will tell you what they expect. So for example, we brought in investors to talk to our entrepreneurs at our incubator to talk about, what's the expectation around how much to dilute by and what valuations are and things like that. And investors will typically say, yes, it's normal to dilute by 25% because they are trying to get as much of your company as possible, right? So you have to consider what lens they're giving advice from. So in that case, if you work with someone who is in your interest instead of maybe even a lawyer, because lawyers are usually in the investor's interest if it's the investor's lawyer. So if you're working with someone who is on your side, they might actually help you negotiate for terms that are most friendly for you. Yeah.
That's good. So next questions. I think it's similar to what you answered before, but maybe you can add on this. So what are the tips on reaching out for executives to be part of your startup advisory team?
Yeah, the biggest takeaway from that process that I walked through is don't jump to it. So take some time, build a relationship. The best advisors are advisors who care about you. Mm-hmm. And you also want to try to get your advisors to be invested in you as well, which is actually one of the reasons why it's great one possible reason to raise capital, because once someone has invested in your company, they will be vested in interest as well, and they'll actually give you good advice. So that's one approach. But the idea is not to jump to it, but you want to go after them, flatter them, get to know them, and you want to make sure that you start to actually build a good relationship and they actually want to help you.
Yeah, I think this is why there's a lot of advice on building up your networking skills to kind of build up the relationship with a lot of potential advisor or potential investors or VC, to help you in the later stage when you're actually ready for the funding.
Best time to seek external secondary funding. I think I talked about that with AARR. So making sure you have activation, acquisition, retention. So if you have those three, then you can probably start to think about external funding. Especially if your goal is to grow a venture scale company, then yeah, sure, you can definitely go out and raise some investors. And then if you're in a growth stage, if you're actually build some momentum, you can, with relative confidence, predict that you can actually bring in income to pay off that debt, then sure.
So next one is, are there any rookie mistakes when it comes to social enterprise?
The biggest one I find is usually social entrepreneurs who think that their business will sell itself because they're doing a do-good business. It's great to have a do-good business, but you want to make sure that the social aspect of it is not the only selling point. Usually, you still need to have a great product or service, and the do-good aspect is the added bonus. I think that applies across the board, even if you're deciding that you want to find impact investors and things like that. So you have to be financially sustainable. So a lot of social entrepreneurs tend to focus so much on how they're helping people. They don't think about the customers, how are they actually going to maintain revenue, things like that.
Yep, that's good. So next question is, how can an accountant or financial advisor best support a startup business?
Accountants, financial advisors, probably they're a bit underrated when it comes to how they can actually help, but they actually add a lot of value. So the best way to leverage them is not to just think about them as the bookkeepers. They don't just help you track your expenses, but they can actually do a few things. So one is, if you're working with accounting firms that are familiar with startups, then the amazing thing is they actually have a great network of potential partners, potential customers, or maybe even other companies that are in the similar space, so they can kind of give you insight on what works, what doesn't work, who you should connect with. So you want to tap into their network as well. The second thing is you want to actually look to them for strategic advice, not just financial advice, because if they look at the numbers, they usually know before possibly even you do on what might be sliding, what might be going wrong, which channels you might want to focus on, things like that.
Okay, so we have another question. If you have limited capital, which advisors would you consider paying for first? Would that be marketing, sales, or accounting?
Usually, if you have limited capital, you probably don't have to worry too much about paying any advisor, because depending on the type of company you have. So if you have a tech company, usually your advisors are compensated via equity. If it's a non-tech company, depending on where you're at and what advice you need, you might or might not need to actually find a paid advisor. But this also probably applies to the team side. If you have limited capital, who you want to hire first, marketing, sales, or accounting. And I usually say, you spend money where it can bring you more money. That's a good rule of thumb to start, because if you spend in sales, the idea is that if you improve sales, then sales will bring in more revenue, and therefore will help you scale. So sales and marketing is a good place to start, and then you can think about product and accounting and all the other pieces.
So next question: throughout different stages along the journey, how to ensure knowledge sharing among co-founders about entrepreneurship while maintaining collective diversity?
Ideally, if you have put together a good team, then you won't usually end up in areas where you have too much conflict. So that's usually the concern I get when people think about cognitive diversity. The idea is, because you're aligned on the mission, you're all not throwing different ideas on different things. You're still working on the same mission. And then the second thing is, because you align on values, the way you approach how to solve the solution is similar. So you're not going to do something that is way out of the left field. But then that really opens up the room to come up with creative ideas where the type of ideas align on mission and values, but there are different perspectives, and then that's where you get to debate on what you can try, what you want to test. So I'd say having transparent communication and just making sure that you document everything and test, because as new co-founders join the team, usually not all of them might understand, oh, why aren't you doing this? I have this great idea. Why are you dismissing it? And maybe I can show them, hey, we've already tested this. These are the results. So it just helps with the transfer of knowledge. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How often do you perform customer discovery as you build your startup idea?
All the time. So customer discovery never ends. It's not just a validation piece. So a great example is, there was one company we worked with where they had baby products, and they were noticing that over a single year, they had a huge drop in sales, and they didn't know what exactly happened. So we told them, go out, speak to your customers, interview your customers, and through doing that, they noticed that actually what had happened is there was a generational shift in who the parents were. So it used to be that baby boomers were parents, and now millennials were the new generation of parents. So the language, the channels, the how they describe the product, all of that needed to be changed. The products and services was still the same, but it's just how they actually described it. The copy needed to be adjusted, and like at the end of the day, like the market will always shift, the market will always change. So the idea is you always need to have a close ear on your customers.
Mm-hmm. What are the top reasons for startup failure, and what are the best practices to avoid them?
Spending too much time on the wrong things. So there's this concept called Pareto principle, 80-20. So I see a lot of founders like spending time on like branding and logo and product. Like those things, not to say that they're not important, but they might not be the most important at this stage, especially if you're in the idea stage. So the idea is you want to actually spend on the 20% that gives you the 80% results. So in that case, you might be like focusing on sales or focusing on the best clients or best customers that will actually be willing to pay for your product service. So that could be one of the things. Being too frugal in the wrong way is another big reason why a lot of startups fail. A lot of founders don't want to spend. I mean, it's good to be frugal, but you don't want to inhibit spend where it will also inhibit growth. So you want to spend where it's appropriate and spend where it will actually allow you to grow and do more things. Elaborate me on AARR. So acquisition would be what channels are you getting your customers from? So for example, it might be, are you getting customers through walk-ins, through referrals, through Facebook ads, through Google ads, right? Through workshops, things like that. So what is your acquisition channel? And then cost of acquisition. So cost of acquisition is a bit trickier to measure. So if you are a simplified tech company, the easiest way to actually look at that is like, let's say, for example, you spend $10 on Facebook ads, that gets you 10 customers. Then a simplified calculation is basically it costs you $1 to get one customer, right? But of course, there are other things that you need to consider as well, because acquisition also involves your salaries, time you spend on project, things like that. So you want to consider that as much as you can, because that is also built into acquisition. Activation, that is also defined on how you define the sort of value threshold. So in that case, let's say Foodie is an example. So Foodie is a Vancouver-based company. They do food delivery. And when they started, they did food delivery for customers. Now they do food delivery for corporations. So they do more like corporate catering. But one of their activation points is they noticed that, sure, not only people download, but actually do they make the first order. So that's one of the activation points. Another activation point that they looked at is they noticed that most of the customers who made 3 or more orders would be long-term customers. So everything they do, they would try to get people to make at least 3 orders. So that's the piece on activation. Like, sure, do people not only download, but do they actually use it? And it applies to non-tech as well. Like, do people not only come in and look at your grocery store or try out your service or book a free trial, but do they actually continue to use your product service? Retention, that one, I guess it really depends on the lifetime value of your customer. So can you actually make enough money out of the customer? Do they stay around long enough that if you're not making money from them, that you can probably figure out how you can make money from them? So for example, if your cost of acquisition, let's say it's $5 per customer, and if they join your platform, they use it, and then 2 weeks later they stop using it. And when I say platform, it can apply to non-tech as well, right? So like, let's say you open up a restaurant and one customer comes once and they never come back again, then there's probably something wrong with retention, right? So how can you try to track that? So tracking can come in many different forms. So let's say if you're a restaurant, like having those reward cards where you stamp them so you can see how many times people come back. Or you see retail stores, they have those customer loyalty programs where, if you have let's say a Costco card or a Save On card, it actually tracks how many times you come back. So that's the idea of like trying to see how long your customer stays with you, what the lifetime value is. And what you're aiming to do is you want to have LTV higher than cost of acquisition. Because if you're making more money per customer than it costs you to acquire them, then you're basically printing money and you can start to scale.
What is the healthy ratio for that cost of acquisition and the lifetime value of a customer?
Ratio, I would say as long as your LTV exceeds CAC, you're in the green. Usually investors like to look at a 3-to-1 ratio. That means you have 3 times more LTV than your cost of acquisition. I think that's to consider and build in all the other external factors as well, like what could happen if the market crashes, What if your customers, lifetime value decreases? Like, let's say they stop staying as long. If your cost of acquisition doesn't include like some of the other factors, like your operation costs, your rental, things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. So next questions. With COVID-19 lockdown, how do you recommend to go about customer discovery? It's harder to get a coffee meeting nowadays.
It really depends on the product and solution that you have. Most startups are not usually customer-centric. If you are customer-centric, where you have to go directly after the consumer, then you want to try your best to try to find. So first off, I try to avoid going after friends and family. They usually have very biased views on your startup. They either are really against it or really supportive of it, and it usually kind of colors their feedback. So I try to get people who are possibly like friends of friends as a starting point. That's if you're consumer-centric. If you're business-centric, it's a bit easier. If you're business-centric, you're basically going after your target customers. And it is very much like sales, but the nice part about business-centric is, or actually applies to customers as well, is when you approach it with a customer discovery perspective, you're not trying to sell someone a product or service. You're just trying to get feedback on an idea. So you might say, hey, you know what? I'm thinking of starting a startup. I have this perspective. I think that, let's say, for example, I think that, women have high-risk pregnancies because they struggle with monitoring their blood glucose level, for example. What do you think of that? So like when you start that way, then the conversation is not sales oriented. So people are usually more willing to give feedback. And then these type of people, you want to capture their information as well, because they could eventually become your first few customers. So then effectively, once you've done customer discovery, you already have some prospective customers to sell to as well. So interviewing on the internet, if at all possible, you want to try to have a video call if possible, because when you do customer discovery, you can see their intonation, you can actually read their body language as much as you can. If you just send out a survey, usually it doesn't give you a lot of detailed information. You kind of ask why, you kind of get into more details. So on the consumer side, posting in, let's say, meetup groups, in community groups, you want to look at going to places where people care about the cause that you're doing. So for example, if you might, let's say you're opening a restaurant and you're like, how do I get in front of possible customers? Then you might go into a foodie related meetup group or foodie related blog post or something like that, and just say, hey, I have this idea, I love some feedback from the foodie community. If you're B2B, then you want to actually do prospecting. So find a company on LinkedIn, find who you want to reach out to, send them an email, and just try to connect with them and get some feedback.
Yeah, and also you can definitely reach out to your network and say, I have this idea, I'm looking to talk to this certain group of people. Do you have someone to refer to me? And then that can also start some conversation, and because at the end of the day, you're trying to solve their problem and try to figure out what their problem is to actually find a solution to solve their problem. So usually that works, and usually you get the referral that you need. Okay, so next, what mistakes do you see for e-commerce startups?
E-commerce is tough. Why I say it's tough is because I find that e-commerce entrepreneurs are typically the ones that are most opportunistic that I've seen. They usually just carry any product that will sell. So the biggest mistake that I see is usually that they don't have alignment on a cause. So for example, I hope my wife can hear this because her brother is in e-commerce. So her brother actually runs an e-commerce store, and they started with sustainable products. So they had like drinking straws that were metal straws. They had a few other stuff. And I actually told him, like, hey, why don't you focus on having your e-commerce store just focus around sustainable products? Because then you can actually build a community, a strong brand around that. And then there's actually alignment, and it's easier for you to cross-sell and upsell and things like that. And then he just started carrying all sorts of products. He had like baby products now and this and that. So when you don't have a common brand, then you're in a very tough space to compete with other e-commerce companies, because you're basically just a distributor. You don't really have a customer brand. There's no loyalty, so it is a bit dangerous in that sense. So that's kind of one of the biggest mistakes I see, I guess.
Yeah, and it's hard to beat the Amazon now. So yeah. So I guess that's the problem. You mentioned startups should be doing customer discovery all the time. Do you recommend interviewing the same people or new ones every time?
Both. So of course you don't want to just constantly nag the same person over and over again to give you feedback. It's more like building a relationship with them. So, for example, through Spring, when we were running our programs, the customer discovery doesn't have to be a formal interview. You don't have to say like, hey, I want to do customer discovery with you. Can you book a time with me, right? So, for example, when we had our programs, every time a company would actually, or an entrepreneur would graduate from a program, I would say, hey, you know what? I'd love to get your feedback on how the program went. Would you be down to kind of give me an update on your company and what's going on? And then I might check in with them. I might, reach out to them 6 months later and say, hey, how are things going? It's been 6 months. Just want to hear where you're at, what you're up to, what has changed. And then when I'm actually checking in with them, I actually ask them a few specific questions as well that I'm looking for feedback on. So you do want to have regular touch points with the same people, but of course, check out new people as well, because sometimes you might see that you might be getting new customers that are not fitting the same mold, that are maybe in different markets, that are having different interests as well.
That's good. So that's the last questions. So let's join us to Frank Chin for this wonderful workshop in terms of, that's one more question. So, okay, let's do it. Okay, so if my market is small business most affected by COVID right now, what if insights from customer discovery are heavily affected by COVID or temporary trend? So it's only maybe for this certain period.
Good question. And this is so hard. I don't think I have a magic pill for this answer. But to the best of my knowledge, the first thing that you want to identify is what are patterns of behaviors that are being built now that will persist? Because what you're seeing with the COVID situation is that people are starting to form a lot of new habits because they are changing, what they can or cannot do, where they can or cannot shop. So that's really affecting what might last in the long term as well. So it takes an average of about 60 days to build a new habit. So you want to think, what habits are habits that will persist? And if it will persist, what do you need to adjust in order to address that? And if they won't persist, then it's probably just something temporary. So yeah, that's probably one thing to think about. So the online piece, for example, like a lot of people moving to online, a lot of events moving to online, that is likely to probably last longer than you think, because it will be at least more than 6 months from now before we can even go back to regular events. Like even China, they're back to the normal, but you're still seeing that they're capping events at or meetings at 6 people maximum, right? So depending on the type of industry you're in, it's going to be quite difficult to adjust to that. But you're also planning ahead. So it's not just the COVID situation, but we're looking at a recession now. So what is going to happen? What is going to change? How are people going to be tighter with their budgets? What will they care about? So that's where you need to figure out, do you need to change your value proposition? Is the perception of value changing if you're moving your content online, right? So for example, in my case, I found that for events, it's actually easier to reach a larger audience online. So that's the benefit. It is harder to monetize, but I'm seeing it as a marketing opportunity instead. And then on the flip side, my actual product offering, which is I run these accountability groups where I help people with building new habits, building personal development, improving their skills. Those kind of things, I was planning on making that in-person meetings. So I'm now shifting to thinking, okay, maybe if in-person meetings are not going to be an option, how can I do my best to make sure that the online meetings actually deliver maximum value? So kind of thinking about how I can shift that. Is it going to be transient? Is it going to be long-lasting? And kind of going with the flow and basing on that. So I don't think I have an easy answer for that.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one, and because we don't know how long this will kind of last, and if we are going to do it for another year or two, then it's a totally different story.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's hit the questions here. Anyone have more questions? Let's go to our Slido and ask the question there. Okay. Let me go back to this. So there's no more questions. Going one, going twice. Okay, so let's thank Chin for helping us answer a lot of those questions and advice for early stage startups in terms of how to avoid those and how to validate their business idea.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.